We are on Kilayim, Perek Zayin, Mishnah Zayin. Says the Mishnah, Haruach she'il'ila et hagfanim al gabei hatfuah. Let's say the wind, il'ila is a funny word, but it means to blow, like to blow, to force, with great force. So the wind with great force blew the gfanim. It blew the vines al gabei hatfuah. So let's say, for example, we've learned in many cases that a single vine, if I have a vine, how far away do I have to have my tevuah? Only shesh tfachim. Shesh tfachim, it's an amma basically. Okay? A little more than amma. So you have to have this far apart. So let's say I grew corn here and I grew a grapevine here. It's very easy to imagine the corn is going to blow over, or the grapevine will blow into the corn. It's not so hard. So is that make it mekadesh? Says the Mishnah, yigdor miyad. Gader from the word yigdor, from the word gader, you should immediately fence them off. You have to separate them immediately. Okay? Some say yigdod, the Kahati says, which means to cut the zmarot or the gfanim. You have to cut it back to make sure that that can't happen again. It doesn't make it mekadesh, as we'll see. If something prevents you from taking care of it immediately, mutar. That's permitted, i.e. because it was something out of your control. Okay? Even if we had a tosefet of echad mimatayim, it grew in between from when I was aware of it until I was able to pull it back or make the fence or cut back the grapes, it's still mutar because it wasn't midat, and it's also, as we're going to see, not asur up to the point of mekadesh. Tvu'ato shehi no tachat hagefen. Similarly, let's say my grain, my tvu'ah, my corn, no tachat hagefen, it blew under the gefen. V'chein b'yarak, the same is true of vegetables. Machzir ve'eno mekadesh. Machzir means you push it back, and eno mekadesh, it's not mekadesh. Why? What's the difference? Okay, says the Bartanura, ve'eno mekadesh. Why? Im lo chzir eno mekadesh, dehadidna, that which we learned le'el before. Tachat gefen oser u'mekadesh. If it's under the gefen, remember, if you grew something under the gefen, it's both oser, prohibited, and mekadesh. That's where if I have the gefen growing here and I plant my roots, the main part is under the gefen. But when the roots, the stalk of the tvuah is chutz legefen, they're separate from each other, and then they go over one another, then they lean, it's not mekadesh. So therefore, everything we've talked about of mekadesh is an example where the gefen is above and the tevuah is growing under it. The tevuah is growing, the ikar of the tevuah is growing within the prohibited area. If it's a whole kerem, if it's a whole vine, if it's a whole vineyard, it would be 4 amot. If it's a single vine, it's 6 tfachim. Nextly, the Mishnah says, me'ematai tevuah mitkadeshet. Okay, I made you a little chart here. Okay, so remember we had this pasuk, lo tizra kilayim, pen tigdash, what's tigdash? Hamaleya hazera asher tizra. Lest it become the Malaya Azer Asher Tizra, Utvuat HaKarim, because we have a combination of Malaya Azer Asher Tizra, the produce that's grown, and Tvuat HaKarim. So in order for it to become Kadosh, it has to be Malaya Azer Asher Tizra, growing Zera, and Tvuat HaKarim. Okay, so the Mishnah says, when does that happen? When is the earliest time? Mishet Tashrish. Mishet Tashrish means when it becomes, from the word Shoresh, from the root of Shoresh, of rooted, when it becomes rooted. I'll just show you the Bartanura. He says, eat the garse, some of the gersa, mishet tashlish. Mishet tashlish is from the word shlish, i.e. it grew a third of its full height. So either tashrish, either it is from when it's rooted, from the shoresh, or tashlish, when it grew a third. Va'anavim, when is the earliest time that the grapes become grapes? Mishi asu kipul halavan. When the grapes are growing, they start off as little tiny nothings, and then they grow, and then they ripen. So when they get to the size of a pul halavan, of the white bean, then they're considered grapes, and therefore it's kadosh. What about tvu'ah? Tvu'ah shiyav. What about the end, the last part, the back end? Tvu'ah shiyav shah kol tzorka. If the grain has already dried out completely, i.e. if you ever be in the fields here in Yad Binyamin, you'll see that when you have grain, they let it dry. Well, nowadays they stopped letting it dry, but they used to grow the grain and then they would let it dry in the field, and then cut it down, and then they would do all the things they do. So if it dried out completely, or the grapes that are already completely ripe, they are not mikadesh. So we see here, there's an earlier time before which it's considered full tvua or full grapes, and then a late time afterwards also considered not mikadesh. So let's go just understand that the pasuk says pentitash hamle'a hazara asher tizra utvuata kerem. In order to be mele'a hazara, if it hasn't yet taken root, or the other opinion, if it hasn't taken a third, it's not bichlal meloat hazara. It's not meloat hazara. Similarly, if for it to be tvuata kerem, it has to be, the Mishnah says, mishi asek pul halavan. Because before it's pul halavan, it's not called tvuata kerem. Tvuata kerem means the tvua, the fruit of the kerem, of the vineyard. So it's not considered the fruit of the vineyard, the tvuata kerem, until it's the size of a pul halavan, of the white bean. Similarly, once it's after yavsha kol tzorka, it's already dried, it's not, the Mishnah says, milea hazera, the planted grain, rather it's called dagan or dvor. So now it's just produce. Similarly, once the bishlu kol tzorka, once they're fully ripe, the grapes are called anavim. They're not grapes, they're not tvuat hakerem, they're not grapes. And therefore the Mishnah says that there's a sweet spot here. When it is mikadesh, from when it's tashrish, okay, from the point where it's rooted until yavsha kol tzorko, it's considered grain, lo tazera. And the grapes are from where they're the pula size of pula lavan until they're fully ripe. That's tvuat hakerem. That's the sweet spot. Between this time and that time, that's when it can become takdish. That tikdash. That's when it's tikdash. Until that time, before that time, either for the grapes or the tvua, or after that time, it's not able to be mitkadesh. Stop here. If you have any comments or questions, as always, feel free to contact me at arspolter@gmail.com, and we'll dedicate the learning to the memory of my father, Harav Simcha ben Yitzchak Kalman.